In a courtroom that buzzed with the usual sounds of papers shuffling and murmured conversations, Judge White sat at the bench, his gaze sharp and unyielding as he reviewed the day's docket. The morning was like any other, yet something in the air felt different. The court officers called the next case a speeding violation, and the defendant entered the courtroom with a composed step. Judge White barely looked up as she walked to the front of the room, his mind already preoccupied with the paperwork in front of him. He glanced up only briefly to see a well-dressed black woman in her mid-30s walking toward the podium. She moved with a quiet confidence that made him pause for a second. But he quickly dismissed any second thoughts, believing it to be the poise of a person used to being in front of authority. As the prosecutor began reading the charges, Judge White barely listened. Her attire was neat, a professional suit that suggested she wasn't an ordinary defendant. But he had no reason to suspect she was anything more than a regular person caught speeding that morning. He only half heard the details of her case, a simple speeding violation on a state highway near the city. She claimed she was in a hurry because she was rushing to an important meeting or conference out of town. He didn't care to hear much more. The fact that she was speeding was enough for him. His mind was already set on the next part of the process, and he prepared to issue the fine. He was known for being firm and unwavering in his judgments, even when the cases seemed trivial. And this one felt no different. Speeding was speeding after all, no matter who you were or what your profession might be. But as the woman began to speak, he noticed something different in her demeanor. There was no panic, no desperation, no attempt to manipulate the situation as many other defendants had done in the past. She didn't plead with him or try to spin a sob story about being late to a child's recital or a funeral. She simply stated the facts with calm precision. She introduced herself as Judge Williams from another state, and explained she had been speeding because she had been traveling to a judicial conference that was scheduled to start in a matter of hours. Judge White raised an eyebrow at the mention of her title. It was rare for someone to speak in such an even-tempered tone during such proceedings, and even rarer for a defendant to introduce themselves as a judge in another state. He leaned forward, slightly narrowing his eyes as he looked at her more closely. Judge Williams continued speaking, explaining that she had been trying to attend the conference in time to speak on a panel, and was unaware she had been going over the speed limit at the time. She claimed she wasn't trying to break the law, but was merely focused on getting to the meeting. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as if she was accustomed to handling such situations. He wondered if she thought her profession would earn her special treatment, but the more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that she was simply another person who thought she could bend the rules. Judge White's gaze never left Judge Williams as she spoke. His eyes were cold, calculating, and unforgiving. Her explanation seemed rehearsed to him, as though she was trying to play the part of a rational and reasonable individual who expected some kind of leniency for her professional status. But in his mind, there was no room for special treatment. He had heard every excuse in the book over the years, and this one seemed like just another attempt to avoid accountability. His fingers tapped the edge of the bench as he leaned back in his chair, not impressed by her calm demeanor or her credentials. He had seen other public figures try to use their status to manipulate the courts, and he wasn't going to let that happen today. He let her finish her statement without interruption, his mind already set on the outcome. As she concluded her explanation, he took a deep breath, and with a slight flick of his wrist motioned for her to stand down. But Judge Williams didn't seem to move an inch. Instead, she stood tall and held her ground. There was no fear in her eyes, only an unwavering composure that surprised him. She wasn't backing down from the situation. She wasn't pleading for mercy or trying to use her title as leverage. Instead, she spoke again calmly, but with a tone that carried authority. She said, "I understand your position, Your Honor, and I respect the law. But I ask only that you consider the facts. I'm not above the law, and I don't expect any special treatment, but I believe my explanation is reasonable, and I ask that you take that into account when making your decision." Judge White's eyes narrowed further. As he listened, he could hear the confidence in her voice and the quiet strength behind her words. It was clear she wasn't intimidated by him or the situation, but he still wasn't willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. His fingers brushed against the papers on the desk as he prepared to make his decision. In his mind, the case was cut and dry. She was speeding, and no matter the reason for it, she would face the consequences just like anyone else. He had dealt with hundreds of defendants over the years, and none of them had earned his mercy. Why should this woman be any different? He glanced at the prosecutor, who stood nearby waiting for him to issue the verdict. Judge Williams didn't seem to notice the shift in the room as Judge White weighed his next words carefully. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, but his resolve remained strong despite the quiet strength she exuded in the moment. There was no way he was going to let her think she could escape the law simply because she was a judge in another state. His voice was firm as he addressed her, saying, "I understand your explanation, Judge Williams, but I'm afraid the law is clear, and you will be fined the full amount of the penalty, and I will not be swayed by your profession or your title." She stood silently for a moment, her expression unreadable, but the weight of his words hung in the air. The room fell silent as he made his final judgment. Judge White's voice echoed through the courtroom as he delivered his sentence, the words hanging in the air heavy and final. Judge Williams remained standing motionless, her face betraying no emotion despite the sting of his words. She had expected this. She knew how courts worked, and she knew how judges like him operated. She had spent enough time in courtrooms of her own to understand the dynamics of authority and the presiding figures who held it firmly in their hands. But even so, there was something in her that recoiled at the decision. This wasn't just about a fine, it was about principle. It was about being judged not for the actions she had committed, but for the perception of who she was and what she represented. Judge White sat back in his chair, his decision made, and the air in the room felt tense, as if every person present was waiting for something more to happen. But there was nothing to say. The case was over, the gavel had fallen, and the fine was set. Judge Williams knew she could protest, but she also understood the futility in arguing further. It would not change his mind, and the last thing she wanted to do was prolong this moment of discomfort for both herself and the people in the room. With a quiet sigh, she turned and walked slowly toward the exit, the soft clack of her heels the only sound breaking the silence as she left the courtroom. Her head held high, her heart heavy, but determined. She had endured worse, and she would endure this too. The moment she stepped out of the courtroom, she felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, disappointment, but also a growing sense of clarity. In a way, this experience had reinforced her purpose. She would not let a moment like this define her. She knew that the work she did for the people and the justice she fought for was more significant than the petty biases of one judge, but the injustice of it lingered in her mind. As she walked down the hall, the faces of those in the courtroom still fresh in her memory, she wondered if anyone had truly understood what had just happened. Had they seen the unfairness in the way she was treated, or were they simply too caught up in the authority that Judge White wielded so easily to question it? Later that day, as she made her way out of the courthouse, she couldn't help but replay the events in her head over and over. The sound of Judge White's voice, the certainty with which he had dismissed her explanations, a look of disdain in his eyes when he had made his judgment. She had been treated not as a peer or a colleague, but as a simple defendant, one whose words carried little weight in the face of his predetermined decision. The injustice of it stung, but she refused to let it break her. She was stronger than this. She would move forward, but not without remembering how easily the law could be wielded against those who were already working within it when it suited those in power. The next few days passed in a blur for Judge Williams as she tried to push the experience out of her mind, but it lingered with her like a shadow. No matter how much she tried to distract herself with work or the upcoming conference she was due to attend, the sting of that courtroom moment kept returning to her. Her pride had been bruised, but her sense of justice was only deepened. She had always believed in the fairness of the law, but this incident had exposed the cracks in the system, the biases that existed even in those who were meant to uphold it. The more she thought about Judge White's actions, the more frustrated she became. It wasn't just the fine that troubled her, it was the dismissal of her profession, the disregard for the fact that she was a judge herself, someone who had spent years studying the law and applying it with fairness and integrity. The assumption that her words didn't matter simply because of her race and gender felt like a direct attack on everything she had worked for. She had stood in front of him as an equal, but he had treated her as inferior, and that was a bitter pill to swallow. Judge Williams knew that this wasn't just about her personal experience, though. It was about the broader picture, about the systemic issues that continued to plague the justice system every day. She had seen it in the courtroom before, the subtle but dangerous biases that affected so many cases. It wasn't always overt racism or sexism, but the quiet ways that the law was applied differently depending on who was standing before the judge. And she couldn't ignore that anymore. Her thoughts drifted back to the conference she was attending soon. It was a gathering of judges from across the region, and she had been invited to speak about judicial ethics and equality. She had been looking forward to it before the incident, but now it felt like a necessity, something she had to do not just for herself, but for the many people who were subjected to the same kinds of unfair treatment that she had just endured. As she prepared for the conference, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would address the issues she had faced in that courtroom, not as a personal grievance, but as part of a larger conversation about how the justice system needed to evolve to become more inclusive and just for everyone. Judge White's actions had shaken her, but they had also fueled her resolve. She would not let this moment define her. She would use it to further her mission to expose the flaws in the system and work toward changing them. As she packed her bags for the trip to the conference, she couldn't help but think about the day ahead and the people she would meet. But in the back of her mind was still the image of Judge White sitting behind that bench, his face hard and unyielding as he made his decision. The fine would be paid, but the real cost had been much greater than money. She knew this was just one chapter in a much larger story, and she was determined to make her voice heard now more than ever. As Judge Williams boarded the plane to the conference, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something unfinished behind her. But she knew she had to keep moving forward. She had too many people counting on her to let one man's prejudice define her path. The flight was quiet and uneventful, but her mind kept drifting back to the courtroom and the harshness of Judge White's decision. The fine was already a done deal, but what stayed with her was the sense of having been dismissed, not for what she had done, but for who she was. She had always prided herself on her ability to rise above such challenges, but this time it was different. This time it had hit her in a place she hadn't expected, in a place where her identity as a judge had been questioned, where she had been treated not as a peer, but as an outsider. She shook her head as if trying to clear the thoughts away. The conference was important. It was a chance to speak out, to educate others, to push for the changes she had always believed in. But even as she looked forward to the event, part of her wondered if Judge White would even care. If he ever realized the mistake he had made, would he acknowledge what had happened? Or would he simply continue to move forward, as if nothing had changed? She spent the night in the hotel going over her speech, practicing her words as she prepared to address the room full of judges and legal professionals. She wanted her message to be clear. She didn't want to make this about her own personal experience, but about the larger issue of fairness and equality in the justice system. It was a delicate balance. She didn't want to come across as angry or accusatory, but she knew she couldn't be silent either. She had worked too long and too hard to stay silent when injustice was at play. She had seen the way the system failed those who were marginalized and the way it often gave those in power the benefit of the doubt when it should not. She had witnessed firsthand how bias crept into decisions, often without conscious thought, and it was time to bring that into the light. As she rehearsed her speech over and over, she felt a sense of purpose growing within her. This wasn't just about one case or one judge. This was about creating a ripple effect that could change the way the law was practiced everywhere. It was about showing that justice didn't have to be blind. It had to be fair. It had to be aware of the biases that influenced decisions every day. When the time came for her to speak at the conference, Judge Williams stood at the podium with confidence and poise. The room was full of experienced judges and legal professionals, but she didn't feel intimidated. Instead, she felt a quiet strength surging through her. She knew what she was about to say needed to be heard. Her voice would not be silenced. She spoke about the importance of acknowledging the biases that existed within the legal system and the responsibility that each judge had to recognize when their own assumptions might be influencing their decisions. She shared stories of those who had been unfairly treated not because of their actions, but because of who they were, and she urged her colleagues to reflect on how their judgments could impact people's lives in ways they hadn't considered before. As she spoke, Judge Williams could see the faces of her colleagues shifting, some of them nodding in agreement, others looking uncomfortable. But she didn't let that stop her. She knew the road to change was never easy, but she was determined to start it right here, right now. As Judge Williams finished her speech, the room fell into a quiet that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Her words had hung in the air, each sentence laced with the weight of experience and a call for change. She scanned the faces of her colleagues in the audience. Some appeared moved, others were contemplative, and a few seemed visibly uncomfortable, but none of them interrupted or dismissed her. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Something had changed. Even if it was just a small moment, she had planted a seed, and she knew it would grow in time. One of the senior judges stood up and walked toward the podium, offering a smile that was both sincere and thoughtful. He was well known in the legal community, a figure respected for his long tenure and accomplishments. He began to speak, and his voice was steady as he acknowledged the points she had made. He admitted that the legal system was not perfect, and that even those who worked within it could fall prey to biases they weren't always aware. He thanked her for bringing the topic to the forefront and emphasized the need for self-reflection in the pursuit of justice. Judge Williams felt a wave of relief wash over her. His words weren't just polite acknowledgments, they were genuine. He wasn't defending the status quo. He was opening the door to a much-needed conversation about how they could do better and how they could hold themselves accountable. She had known that addressing these issues in a room full of judges would be a challenge, but but she hadn't anticipated such a positive response. The following hours of the conference passed by in a blur as more discussions were held. Panels focused on ethics and reform, and Judge Williams found herself at the center of conversations. She hadn't expected people were coming up to her, sharing their thoughts, asking questions, and offering their support. Some admitted that they had never fully considered how their own backgrounds and assumptions affected their rulings. Others expressed a desire to learn more about how they could become more aware of their biases and take steps to avoid them in their future decisions. She could see the change unfolding before her eyes. It wasn't immediate, it wouldn't happen overnight. But this was the beginning of something important, something bigger than one case or one courtroom. This was about shifting the culture of the legal system from within. And that gave her hope. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed, Judge Williams received a message from a familiar name. It was an email from Judge White. The subject line simply read apology. She opened the email and read the words carefully. He expressed regret for the way he had handled her case, and admitted that in hindsight he could see how his actions had been influenced by his own assumptions. He acknowledged the bias he had shown and the unfairness of the fine he had imposed, and offered a sincere apology for the way he had treated her in the courtroom. Judge Williams felt a wave of surprise, followed by a deep breath. As she read the message, he had reached out to her, not to defend himself, but to own up to his mistake. She wasn't sure what to make of it at first, but she knew it was a step in the right direction. He had recognized the wrong and had taken the first step toward rectifying it. She sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on the email and what it meant. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and progress was something she had learned to appreciate even in the smallest doses. She responded to his message with a simple reply, acknowledging his apology and thanking him for having the courage to admit his mistake. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment she felt a sense of relief, knowing that the conversation had begun, and that perhaps things could be different after all. The next morning, Judge Williams woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The events of the previous day seemed to be unfolding in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. The response from her colleagues had been overwhelmingly positive, and now the unexpected email from Judge White had added another layer to the situation. She had been unsure about how to feel initially, but the more she thought about his apology, the more she realized that it was a moment of accountability. Even though it hadn't come from a place of personal reflection at first, it was still a step forward. She had always believed in the power of dialogue and the importance of taking responsibility for one's actions, and while his apology didn't erase what had happened, it was an acknowledgement of her humanity, something that she had desperately needed in that moment. It didn't make the fine disappear or undo the prejudice she had faced, but it made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt before. In that instant, she felt the weight of the moment shift. It was no longer about the case or the fine, it was about the possibility of change, the ability to take a painful experience and use it to spark something better, something more just. She didn't know if Judge White's apology would lead to a transformation in his own practice, or if it would simply be a one-time gesture, but what mattered to her was that the conversation had begun, and that was more than she could have hoped for just a few days earlier. As she sat in the conference hall listening to other judges discuss the importance of ethical reform and bias awareness, she found herself reflecting on her own journey. Her desire to make an impact in the courtroom had always been rooted in the belief that the law should serve everyone equally, but it was becoming increasingly clear to her that the law was too often shaped by biases, both seen and unseen. Judge Williams knew that change would require more than just raising awareness. It would require action at every level of the system. She thought about the stories she had heard from those who had been wronged by the system, from people who had suffered because of assumptions made based on their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. She thought about how many people walked into courtrooms with their voices silenced before they even had a chance to speak, and how many judges sat at their benches unaware of the impact their decisions had on those lives. She had spent years fighting for fairness and equality in the courtroom, but now she realized that it was not just about ruling with impartiality. It was about recognizing the forces that shaped one's perception of fairness and actively working to dismantle those forces where they existed in herself and others. Her time at the conference was not over yet, but it felt as though something had shifted within her. She wasn't just here to share her experiences or talk about reform, she was here to make a difference. And in that moment, she realized that it wasn't enough to simply call for change. She had to be part of it. She had to be the one leading the charge. She had to continue to use her voice, her platform, and her position to challenge the system and ensure that everyone who entered a courtroom was treated with dignity, respect, and fairness, no matter who they were or where they came from. The work was far from finished, but now she knew her path forward was clearer than ever. As Judge Williams returned from the conference, she felt a quiet confidence settle over her. The experience had been transformative not only in terms of her professional growth, but also in the way it had deepened her resolve to continue advocating for justice and equality. She had spent years fighting against systemic biases, but this conference had solidified her understanding of how critical it was to not only confront those biases, but to actively work to dismantle them at every level of the system. When she walked back into her own courtroom the next day, it felt different. Her presence felt stronger, her purpose clearer. She couldn't erase what happened with Judge White, but she now understood that every case, every ruling, every moment in the courtroom was an opportunity to make a difference, not just for the individual before her, but for the larger system she represented. As she sat behind the bench, she glanced at the familiar faces of the attorneys and defendants before her. But today they seemed different too. She knew that each of them carried their own stories, their own struggles, their own history, but now she looked at them with a new sense of empathy and a deeper understanding of the impact her decisions could have on their lives. She wasn't just a judge anymore, she was an advocate for fairness, an advocate for change. She knew that the legal system wasn't perfect, but it was her job to work within it to make it as just as possible for everyone who walked through those doors. She had already started making small changes in her own approach, acknowledging her own biases when they arose and making a conscious effort to ensure that her rulings were informed by the principles of equity and fairness. But she also knew that the work couldn't stop with her. It had to extend beyond her courtroom, beyond her own practice. She began reaching out to colleagues both within her jurisdiction and across the country to discuss how they could implement systemic changes in their own courts. She shared the insights she had gained from the conference, hoping to inspire others to reflect on their own practices and challenge their assumptions. She wasn't asking for perfection, but for a commitment to progress and accountability. She felt a renewed sense of purpose as she worked to push for more comprehensive training on unconscious bias and fair sentencing practices. She was determined to lead by example and show others that change was not only possible but necessary in every corner of the legal system. It wasn't always easy at first. Some of her colleagues were resistant to the idea of confronting their biases. They were comfortable in the way things had always been done, and the thought of change felt uncomfortable to them. But Judge Williams refused to let that stop her. She knew that the fight for fairness would not be won in a single conversation or by a single individual. It would take time, persistence, and a collective effort from everyone in the legal field to create the kind of system where justice truly served all people equally, even those who had historically been marginalized by it. As she walked into court each day, she thought about the people who came before her not just as defendants or litigants, but as individuals with their own hopes and dreams, their own struggles and fears. She knew that her job was to ensure that their voices were heard and that they received a fair trial, no matter their background or circumstances. The experience with Judge White no longer consumed her mind. It had served its purpose. And now it was time for her to move forward, to keep fighting for change, to keep fighting for justice, to keep fighting for those who were too often ignored by the very system meant to protect them. Weeks passed and Judge Williams continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose. Each case she presided over became an opportunity to ensure fairness, but also to challenge the system she knew was flawed at its core. She worked with her colleagues to implement more rigorous bias training and helped to establish workshops on restorative justice, where legal professionals could explore ways to approach cases with empathy and awareness. The change wasn't instant, but she could see the subtle shifts taking place. The discussions were starting to happen more frequently in the halls of the courthouse and during judicial meetings. At first, it was just small conversations about fairness and equality, but slowly those conversations began to grow into something more substantial. There were some difficult moments when her colleagues resisted or felt defensive about their roles in perpetuating inequality, but Judge Williams was persistent. She remained calm when faced with opposition and made it clear that this work wasn't about assigning blame. It was about acknowledging reality and finding ways to create a more just system for everyone. She often reflected on the challenges she had faced throughout her career and how much further the legal system still needed to go. There were still too many cases where the outcome was influenced by a person's race, gender, or socioeconomic status, and far too many instances where defendants felt that the system had already judged them before they ever stepped into a courtroom. She couldn't fix everything on her own, but she knew that by doing her part, she was setting an example for others to follow, and gradually that example would spread to the rest of the legal system. She began to receive messages from other judges, some who had attended the conference and others who had heard about her work from colleagues. They expressed gratitude for her leadership and shared how her efforts had inspired them to take action in their own courts. One judge from another state reached out to say that after attending a workshop led by Judge Williams, he had become more aware of his own biases and had already begun to apply the lessons learned in his own rulings. This kind of feedback was what kept her going. It was proof that change was happening, even if it was slow and sometimes hard to see. But Judge Williams understood that lasting change rarely happened overnight. She knew it would take years for the system to fully evolve and for biases to be addressed at every level, but she was committed to seeing it through. She had taken the first steps, and now she was determined to keep moving forward, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. One afternoon, as she sat in her chambers reviewing a case, she received a letter that caught her attention. It was from Judge White. She hadn't expected to hear from him again after his initial apology, but the letter was different. It wasn't an apology this time. It was a request to meet with her. He wanted to discuss how he could better understand the work she was doing and how he could contribute to the effort to improve the legal system. She wasn't sure what to make of it at first, but she decided to give him the opportunity to speak. She had seen the power of accountability and change within herself, and wondered if Judge White was truly open to examining his own biases and learning from the experience. Their meeting was set for the following week, and as the day approached, Judge Williams couldn't help but feel a mixture of curiosity and caution. Would he show up with genuine intent, or was this another attempt to smooth over his past mistakes? She didn't know, but she was determined to listen and find out. The day of the meeting arrived, and Judge Williams sat at her desk in her chambers, feeling a mix of anticipation and wariness. She had come to appreciate the complexity of people, the way they could surprise you both for better and for worse. She had seen it firsthand in her career how a single moment of self-awareness could change the trajectory of someone's life, or how an unacknowledged mistake could perpetuate harm. She wasn't sure which path Judge White would take when he entered her office, but she was prepared to listen with an open mind and a critical eye. She had been through enough in her career to know that true growth came from humility, not just a few words of apology. She glanced at the clock and saw that it was almost time. He was punctual, and when he entered her office, he seemed nervous. There was no arrogance in his posture, no defensive stance. Instead, he appeared genuinely uncomfortable, as if he was trying to reconcile with something he had been avoiding for too long. She gestured for him to sit and offered a simple greeting. Judge White took a seat across from her, and before either of them spoke, there was an awkward silence in the room, as if both were weighing the gravity of the conversation that was about to unfold. Finally, Judge White broke the silence by speaking quietly, his voice tinged with an unfamiliar vulnerability. He began by acknowledging the work that Judge Williams had been doing, the progress she had made since their initial encounter, and the impact she had had on the broader legal community. He spoke with sincerity about his own struggles with bias and how his experience with her had opened his eyes to the ways in which he had unknowingly perpetuated the system of inequality he had been part of for so many years. He admitted that it wasn't easy to confront his own shortcomings, that it took time for him to really sit with the idea that he had harmed someone even though he hadn't intended to do so. He explained that after their interaction, he had spent weeks reflecting on his own actions and seeking guidance from others. He had spoken with colleagues, mentors, and even counselors to better understand the ways in which his own biases had shaped his decisions over the years. Judge Williams listened carefully to every word. She had expected the meeting to be difficult, but she had not anticipated hearing such a raw and honest account of his personal growth. His words were not just an apology, but an acknowledgement of the work he had done to understand the depths of the issues she had raised in their first encounter. It was a far cry from the dismissive attitude he had displayed in their courtroom. She could see now that his apology had not been merely an attempt to placate her. It had been a result of a genuine inner transformation, one that had taken time and effort. She felt a sense of cautious hope growing within her. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but the fact that he was willing to confront his mistakes and seek change meant something. Judge Williams appreciated the gesture, but she wasn't ready to fully embrace his words. Without seeing more, she asked him what steps he was planning to take moving forward, how he intended to ensure that his future rulings would be free of bias and more reflective of the fairness he claimed to value. He responded by explaining that he had already begun to engage in bias training and was committed to attending more workshops on inclusivity. He also mentioned that he had started mentoring younger judges to help them recognize the importance of self-reflection and accountability in their work. He assured her that he was committed to making lasting changes in his approach to the law, and that he no longer saw his role as one of unquestioned authority, but as one of service to the people he was meant to represent. Judge Williams felt a mixture of caution and optimism. As she listened, she knew that actions spoke louder than words, and she had no doubt that the real test would come in his future rulings. But she also understood that change was a process, not a singular event. She nodded thoughtfully and told him that she appreciated his honesty and the steps he was taking to better himself, but that she would be watching closely. She was a firm believer that actions spoke louder than words, and she would be paying attention to see if he truly followed through with the promises he had made. She didn't say it with malice, but with a quiet understanding that accountability was an ongoing process and that everyone had a responsibility to uphold it. Over the next several months, Judge Williams kept her word. She paid close attention to Judge White's rulings and actions in the courtroom. While she didn't see an immediate change, she noticed subtle shifts in his demeanor and approach to cases. He became more open to discussing his decisions with his colleagues and sought input on difficult cases that required a more nuanced perspective. He was no longer the judge who walked into the room with an air of infallibility. Instead, he seemed to embrace the idea that learning and growth were ongoing processes that even the most seasoned judges could stand to improve. Judge Williams observed these developments with a mix of skepticism and cautious optimism. She had seen too many people make promises they couldn't keep, and she knew better than to jump to conclusions based solely on a few positive actions. But there was something different about Judge White now. She had come to understand that change didn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet and incremental. Sometimes it was about small steps that added up over time, and that gave her hope. She continued her own work on reform within her courtroom and made it a point to mentor younger judges as well. She was passionate about ensuring that the lessons she had learned throughout her career were passed on to the next generation of legal professionals. She wanted them to understand the importance of self-reflection, empathy, and fairness in a system that too often valued rules over people. She also kept in touch with Judge White. They didn't meet often, but when they did, it was always with the understanding that their work was far from finished. They spoke about their experiences with bias, how it had shaped their careers, and how they could continue to fight against it in their respective roles. It was a slow but steady collaboration, one that she had never expected when they first crossed paths, and yet it felt like a necessary part of the journey that both of them were on. Despite their differences, their shared commitment to justice and accountability had brought them together, and now it was shaping the way they approached their work. One afternoon, as Judge Williams sat in her chambers reviewing a case, she received another letter from Judge White. This one was different from the others. It wasn't an apology or a request for guidance. Instead, it was an invitation to collaborate on a project aimed at improving diversity and inclusion in the legal system. He proposed that they jointly lead a series of workshops for judges across the country, focusing on overcoming bias and ensuring that every case was approached with fairness and equity. He acknowledged that the work was difficult, but also necessary, and that if they were to make real change, it would require the collective effort of the entire judicial community. Judge Williams read the letter carefully. Her first instinct was to hesitate, to question whether this was truly a sincere offer or just another attempt to garner favor. But as she read it again, she realized that it was something more. It was a recognition of their shared responsibility to change the system and a desire to create real impact that went beyond their individual cases or experiences. She wasn't sure how it would unfold, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of possibility opening up in front of her. This could be the opportunity to make a broader difference, to influence not just her own courtroom, but the courts across the nation, to push for a legal system that truly represented justice for all. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the moments of doubt, the setbacks, the challenges, but also the growth and transformation she had witnessed in herself and in others, and she realized that despite all the obstacles she had faced, it had been worth it every step of the way. She wasn't done yet. The road ahead was long and the work was far from finished, but she was ready to take on whatever came next. She responded to his letter with a simple but resolute yes, and they began making plans for the workshops with the goal of bringing meaningful change to the judicial system, one lesson at a time. Months passed, and the workshops that Judge Williams and Judge White had planned began to take shape. The first series was set to take place in multiple cities across the country. They had gathered a team of judges, legal professionals, and diversity experts to help facilitate the sessions, and the response had been overwhelmingly positive. When the first workshop finally arrived, Judge Williams felt a sense of anticipation. She had envisioned this moment for so long, and now it was becoming a reality. She stood before a room full of judges from various backgrounds and jurisdictions, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a deep sense of purpose. She knew that this room was filled with people who had the power to make lasting change within the judicial system, people who could take the lessons they were about to learn and apply them to their work in ways that would ripple out across their courts and communities. As the workshop began, Judge Williams spoke about the importance of self-reflection, the need for judges to recognize their own biases, and how these biases could shape their decisions in ways that were often unconscious. She spoke passionately about her own experiences with bias and the lessons she had learned throughout her career. She shared stories from her own courtroom and the ways in which she had worked to create an environment where fairness was not just a principle, but but a practice. She saw the impact her words were having on the group. Some were nodding in agreement, others were taking notes, but what struck her the most were the questions that began to emerge from the audience. Judges were asking about practical steps they could take to ensure their rulings were more equitable. They wanted to know how they could better recognize their biases, how they could ensure that they were not perpetuating the same injustices they had spent years fighting against. It was a moment of true collaboration, a moment where the legal community as a whole was acknowledging the need for change and taking responsibility for it. Judge White also spoke during the workshop, sharing his own journey of self-discovery and growth. He admitted that when he had first encountered Judge Williams, he hadn't fully understood the weight of his actions, but over time and through deep self-reflection, he had come to see how his biases had affected not only his rulings but his ability to serve the people who came before him. He spoke honestly about the steps he had taken to better himself, and how he was committed to continuing the work for the rest of his career. It wasn't an easy journey, he admitted, but it was a necessary one that required patience, humility, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Judge Williams watched as the room reacted to his words. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, and she could feel the collective shift that was happening. This wasn't just a lecture or a series of presentations. This was a moment of transformation for everyone involved. It was a moment when people acknowledged their shared responsibility to create a system that was truly just and fair. She felt a sense of pride in what they had accomplished so far, but she knew that this was only the beginning. The work had just started, and there was still so much to be done. But for the first time, she felt hopeful that the future of the legal system could be different, that change was not just possible but inevitable if they kept pushing forward together. Judge Williams and Judge White continued their efforts, traveling from city to city, holding workshops and speaking with other judges about the importance of dismantling bias and fostering a system rooted in equity and fairness. They didn't have all the answers, but they were committed to learning together and working toward a better future for the courts and the people they served. It was a long road ahead, but they were ready for it. They knew that as long as they stayed committed to the work, they could make a difference one step at a time. As the months passed, Judge Williams and Judge White continued their work, and the workshops became more than just a platform for learning. They became a movement. Each city they visited brought new faces eager to confront their own biases and transform their understanding of justice. With every conversation, there was a shared sense of responsibility and a commitment to make real change. They had moved beyond just words into action, and the ripple effects were slowly but surely spreading across the judicial system. One day, as Judge Williams stood in front of a room full of judges at the final workshop of the year, she looked around and felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The room was filled with faces from all walks of life, some of them young and eager, others seasoned and reflective, but all of them committed to doing the hard work of changing the system from within. She started her speech not with the usual statistics or abstract ideals, but with a story of her own journey, one that had been filled with setbacks, but also profound lessons. She spoke of the moment she had faced off with Judge White in that tense courtroom, the moment that had set the wheels of transformation in motion. She told them about the challenges she had faced being a woman of color in a system that had long been shaped by biases, and how she had fought tirelessly to ensure that fairness and justice were more than just words written on paper. She spoke about the significance of her encounter with Judge White, not just because of the apology he had offered, but because it had forced her to confront the way systems of power could both limit and liberate her. It had shown her that change was not just about confronting others, but also confronting herself. Judge Williams paused and let the weight of her words sink in. She wanted them to understand that this journey was not just about fixing the flaws of the system, it was about understanding the human side of the law, that justice could not be blind if it didn't see the humanity in those it served. She could see in their eyes that they were listening intently. She could feel the energy in the room shift as they absorbed the deeper meaning of her message. She then spoke about how the road ahead was still filled with challenges. The legal system was not going to change overnight, and not every judge would be open to confronting their biases. But she also knew that the work they had started was not something that could be easily undone. They had started a dialogue, one that was too powerful to ignore. They had laid the groundwork for a more inclusive system where everyone's rights were valued and protected. Judge Williams reminded them that the true measure of progress wasn't in the number of workshops held or the speeches given, but in the small actions that happened every day in courtrooms across the country. It was in the judge who took a moment to reconsider a ruling, the one who asked for a second opinion, the one who acknowledged their biases and made an effort to do better with each case. She knew that the journey was ongoing, but she also knew that the momentum they had created could not be stopped. As she finished her speech, she looked out over the crowd one last time with a quiet smile, and said that while they couldn't change the world in a single day, they could start by changing the way they saw each other And with that simple but profound truth, Judge Williams knew that the work had only just begun, but it was a work worth doing, and that together they could build a more just and fair system, one ruling at a time. As the room erupted in applause, she realized that the true victory wasn't in the workshops or the speeches or even the apologies. It was in the hearts and minds of those in the room who were now ready to carry the torch of justice into the future.